Welcome to Godsplaining, Contemplative Preachers, Contemporary Age. Each week, join the Dominican friars as they consider all things Catholic.
Hello and welcome back to Godsplaining. I am Father Gregory Pine, joining here from Switzerland, and we have Father Jacob Bertrand Jancic in Washington, D.C. How are things, Father Jacob Bertrand?
Yeah, I'm good. I was actually hoping for you to say something like, say, hi, Father Jacob Bertrand, so I could have pulled the line of just like, hi, Father Jacob Bertrand, that, you've done before. So clever. But, I'm well. Thanks for asking. Things are going all right. Yeah. Nothing terribly new or exciting, but, just kind of carrying on here in D.C. Semester started, and we are just kind of cruising ahead through a cold, well, for D.C. it's cold now, but it's not really cold in the grand scheme of things, but a cold D.C. So that's it.
Nice. And vocation things? Good, bad, indifferent, excellent, catastrophic? I'll give you all kinds of options.
Yeah, thanks. I guess my attitude towards them is probably indifferent, but they're going well enough. So,
nice.
No, things are well. Things are going well. So, the spring gets a lot busier in the application world. So that's what we're doing now. We're looking forward to hosting our vocation weekends in February and April, taking all the the COVID precautions that we need. But we did that in the fall, and it turned out to be really great. So we're doing the same in the spring, and that's kind of it on the vocation calendar of events and that sort of thing. But at least good enough, and allows men a glimpse of our life and that. So yeah. Yep. What's new in Switzerland? Probably not much, huh?
Not much. People are doing things. They're saying things in languages that I barely understand. I'm smiling when they do and nodding, unless they raise the inflection at the end of that sentence, and then I say, yes, of course. Unless I can recognize a word in that sentence to which I do not agree, and then I say, interesting, and then I just wait for them to solve their own problem. So I would say that things are going well. Based on my limited understanding of what's transpiring in my immediate vicinity. But yes, other than that, let's see. Everyone's gearing up, getting excited for, as it were, in Switzerland, their place in the COVID vaccine dissemination kind of like plan or scheme. So there are a couple of men with whom I live who are in their 80s, and I know that they kind of like put their name in the lottery. But it has occasioned conversations at the table, and certainly conversations here in the country, and certainly in the United States as well. So we thought that we'd take the opportunity just to talk a little bit about the vaccine. Why? Because we have credentials in science? Certainly not. No, because it's helpful sometimes just to kind of talk through the matter, so that way one is just better informed as to what it is, what's going on, and the type of decision that one makes when approaching it. I think that in the 21st century, certainly there's, what would one say? Not necessarily a crisis of authority, but a weakening of authority, as I think people can tend to be suspicious of political leaders, or maybe less than excited to listen to religious leaders of whatever sort. So this is, intended just as a way by which to kind of chat through some of the issues that surround it and shed some light. And I don't know that we necessarily have like concrete proposals. We didn't bring our posters that say like do this or do that, but figure entertain some things.
Yeah, I think too the whole we can't neglect the reality that everything is, and especially in the U.S. I don't know what it's like in Switzerland. I have no idea what the culture or the political scene is like there, but here in the country. In the United States, everything is also so right. Everything's also so politicized that you can turn on one news channel or turn on another news channel, go on this website or do this Google search, and you can get completely different takes or completely different principles. So, as Father Gregory was saying, we don't have a sort of pro-anti-vaccine agenda that we're sort of trying to subtly infuse into your minds, but like with all things, I think it's good to examine the principles that inform our decision making from solid Catholic thought and teaching. Not solid from us, well, hopefully solid from us, but solid from like great minds that we rely upon. So
we'll direct you to the solid reasoning of others, which we ourselves have appropriated. First point being that lots of people are saying lots of things, but we can kind of class them in two general ways. So there's some people who are saying that you have a moral responsibility to get the vaccine. There are some people who are saying that you have a moral responsibility, far fewer people, saying that you have a moral responsibility not to get the vaccine. Obviously, there are people who are saying other things that are, and many people are saying things that are more subtle and nuanced, but just kind of group them in these categories. And some of the reasons that you hear, again, not exhaustive, but some of the reasons that you hear are for moral responsibility is that it's charitable, right? It's the charitable thing to do. And then also that it pertains to the common good. And then for those who say that you have a moral responsibility not to get it, sometimes it's like kind of grouped under the general category of vaccines are bad, or specifically this vaccine is bad. And then the big one, which is probably the most urgent, is that it deals with tissue of aborted children. So there are reasons on the table in both camps, and good reasons certainly to be entertained, not necessarily to be dismissed or lampooned. So we just want to clear up some of the issues so as to, again, help make an informed decision. So let's start with you have a moral responsibility to get it. The first point being it's charitable. You have some first thoughts, first impressions, anything that registers for you there?
Yeah, one of the things that we have to, in order to make these distinctions, we have to understand what pertains to charity, or how is charity applied to our living. And I think that the hierarchy or the ordering of charity is important to enunciate first, right? So, like, to whom do we owe charity? To whom do we owe love? And those virtues and those goods that fall under that theological virtue of charity. So, as Christians, we understand, and hopefully other people do too, that the first in the order of charity is not me. It's not that the world revolves around me, but it's God. That our lives are ordered by or through charity to God, to love of God and love of God in Himself. Second on that list, though, in the order of charity is not others, but ourselves. It's that it's God ourselves. We have to love ourselves and look out. As this sounds kind of selfish, but look and act for our own good, so as to be able to love others. If our own good is not pursued, then we actually can't pursue the good of others, or we can't love others. And others are, third in at least this truncated list. So God, self, others. So I think that's important to recognize that charity is actually, there's an order to charity, and that order to charity ought to define then how we interact with one another. So in this instance of talking about a vaccine, that order of charity is important, because we have to look at it with respect to God. How does this vaccine, and this might seem silly, but how does a vaccine, or how does engaging in the moral questions surrounding a vaccine and reacting to that affect my relationship with God? How does it affect myself, but also how does it affect my relationship with others? I think that's an important kind of hierarchy to register in our own minds.
Yeah, and because the God, self, others ranking is so contrary to what many people would learn in Sunday school, it kind of merits, maybe just a touch more consideration, because I think that we have in our minds that you can either be loving, which is to say like altruistic, or you can be selfish, which is to say, self-regarding. But that's not right. That's not necessarily a Christian teaching. I think that's a kind of false dichotomy, right? We're actually commanded or encouraged to love others as we love ourselves, right? Obviously, to love others as the Lord loves, but that's mixed in with the commandment, to love others as we love ourselves. And I think the basic idea there is we love God because, God is most interior to us of anything in the world, right? God gives us our very being, God makes us to act, and so God is nearer to ourselves than we are, in fact. But then when it comes to, those over whom you have immediate care, the next person to be considered is yourself. And that subsequently you make considerations of those who are kind of part of you, right? Or those who pertain to you, or those whose goods you've been charged with the care of. So it's not so much a matter of like altruism or of, egotism, as it is a matter of considering like, for whom am I responsible, or over whom has the Lord given me care? And I think that works some way towards dispelling this notion that I always have to be other regarding, or I am thereby selfish and sinful, because that's not necessarily the case. So that maybe just makes the matter a little more textured, a little more nuanced, a little more subtle. But perhaps now we can move on to our next point. So again, we're talking about you have the moral responsibility to get it, it is said. For one reason that is cited is charity. The next reason that you often hear is because it pertains to the common good. So Father Jacob Birch, you want to set us up for a little discussion here on the common good?
Yeah, again, I think we have to establish what precisely is the common good in order to talk about it. So quickly, the common good. When we talk about the common good, often we think of things in earthly terms, or things that build up society, culture, the politic, those kind of things that conduce to good living in those circumstances. But ultimately, the real sort of end of the common good in the Christian context is God. That society, culture, the politic, the world in which we live is built in such a way that each person can pursue God as the ultimate good. Now, of course, that doesn't negate the reality that there are ordered goods or lesser goods underneath, and goods of undoubted value. So, for example, family life, children, these sorts of things, love, friendship, and then even further down, like having a good meal, enjoying these sorts of things. There are all these goods that we pursue, but it's important to have in mind the question of, well, ultimately, what do all of those things combined together? What are they after? And that's union with God. So, turning to the virus, turning to a vaccine, then is in a sort of moral responsibility realm. Does getting a vaccine contribute to that common good? Well, I think in some ways, yes, but not absolutely speaking. I don't think that having a vaccine or getting a vaccine necessarily makes one more capable of pursuing their highest good of their life. But I do think it can contribute to it in other ways, by preserving life, for example, creating a society where we don't have to continually live under fear or worry or wear masks or put others in danger. Like, all of these things are good and important goods. But they all are relative to that ultimate good that our common living is really seeking, or should be seeking.
Yeah, I think I was thinking here about a line from one of John Henry Newman's sermons, where he says, basically, like, a single venial sin is worse than the destruction of the entire universe. And you're like, wow, jeepers. And the reason he says it in those stark terms is because, maybe you don't say jeepers unless you're like Thelma from Scooby-Doo. The reason he says it in those stark terms, the reason he says it in those stark terms is to bring before our eyes the fact that a moral evil is far, far worse than a natural evil. And so what we're dealing with is unparalleled for many of us, right? In our lifetime, we haven't encountered anything the likes of which compares to this pandemic. And so sometimes it can seem like the worst thing imaginable, but it's not, right? So sin is worse. And when it comes to the common good, the best contribution that we ourselves make is by being saints. So it's not just a matter of, like, if I wear my mask and if I get my vaccine, then I am a secular saint. It's like, well, I mean, we're not so much interested in being secular saints. I think it's good to contribute to the common good of the polity, but, the common good of the polity is something that is related, like you said, bound up with the common good of the family, and it's ordered to, like, the common good of the church, the common good of God, who is, St. Thomas says, the common good of the whole universe. So there's a hierarchy to it. And so we shouldn't think about our contribution to it in, like, base or materialistic or kind of like leveling terms. It's something that should be part of a bigger picture, a transcendent order to, the God who gives us life, who gives us grace, who calls us to him. So yeah, that's just, again, to kind of put it in the context of a bigger conversation. So with that, then, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when I think of the question of, like, am I morally responsible for, what's the answer to this kind of moral kind of thing, or how do you approach it? I think that we can say in charity and in the pursuit of the common good that there is a responsibility, but I don't think it's a responsibility that binds always and everywhere. If you kind of lay out what we just said, and as we'll talk about more in the episode, but just to kind of respond to that first question that Father Gregory, put forth, is there a moral responsibility? Perhaps in some ways. Is there an absolute binding sort of responsibility? Well, I think that's a bit more nuanced as we, are fleshing out today.
Yeah, and a good analogy for that would be, so we all as human beings have a natural inclination, St. Thomas says, to procreate and educate our children, right? We all are naturally inclined to family life. So that's a good for human beings, and it's necessary for the upbuilding of society. It's necessary for like the continuing unto generation after generation. But does that mean that everyone is responsible for getting married and having kids? If so, then we are most to be pitied among men. Right?
Yeah.
So it's something that's, again, more subtle, more nuanced. It admits of exceptions, if those exceptions pertain in their own way, in their proper way, to the common good. So with that discussion then of whether you have a moral responsibility to get it under the aspect of charity and common good, we'll take a short break here, and when we come back, we'll talk about the arguments on the opposite side.
This is Godsplaining. Get up to date on all our latest episodes at opeast.org/Godsplaining.
And welcome back to Godsplaining. Father Gregory Pine here. You knew that because that interruption was only like 31 seconds long, and it wasn't nearly long enough to constitute something that would pose a real distraction to your focus. But hey, you made it, so congratulations. We're back here talking about COVID vaccines. So whether one is responsible for getting one, whether one is responsible for not getting one. It's kind of a complicated way of saying it, but there you go. Father Jacob Bertrand, you studied science, broadly so-called. I don't actually know what all is involved in science because I haven't studied science since high school. I did some mathematics, which is like science for people who, would prefer not to think about real
Not
stuff.
to have friends.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. For those who were born with, pocket protectors just hanging out in the breast pocket. So maybe just to kind of get in then to these questions about okay, so we said the two big arguments against getting it is because the vaccines, or this vaccine in particular, are somehow bad or pose significant risks or threats. And then the question about aborted children, like fetal tissue, as it were. So we'll treat that one second. But the first one about vaccines are bad. You've got some science knowledge. Lead us in.
Yeah, so I don't have any science knowledge, Father Gregory, but thanks. That's really setting me up to fail. I have a science degree for my undergraduate work, which was like eons ago. I'm very old now. So, but yeah, so vaccines are bad. I think in some ways that, there are certainly people who are against vaccines or have problems with vaccines or issues with vaccines. But I do think that by and large, there isn't really an anti-vaxxer kind of, culture in the country. I think most people are reasonable and want to put things in their body that are good or at least not harmful. So I don't think that, I think sometimes we kind of, there's an easy kind of caricature that people, if somebody stops to wonder, well, what am I putting in my body? Then they fall into this sort of radical, whether super left or super right, because there are arguments on both sides, but like kind of anti-vaxxer, unreasonable. And I just don't think, maybe there are people like that, but I think by and large, that's not the case. But I think that, vaccines, the question of whether or not vaccines are bad, I think it really boils down to whether or not they harm the individual or the common good. I don't think we would want to take medicines or medications that would be, harmful to the individual but good to others. And I don't think we would want to take medicines that are good to the individual but harmful to others. And I think by and large vaccines don't fall into either of those two categories. Obviously, the COVID vaccine, I think, falls in a different or another category here because it's so new and because it's so, has so little research behind it as a vaccine as in itself. Now, of course, the parts that were used to make the vaccine, that using mRNA, that research has been around for decades and decades, and the cell lines that they've been using have been around for decades, and all of these things are not new, but they've been put together in a new way and are being put into the human body in a new way. So I think that it does beg the question, or at least I think responsible people should, or it's a responsible thing to do to say, well, is this good? Not in a sense of like distrust medical professionals outright, but to read what's in it, to read, do your research. Do you look at what's going on besides just saying like moral responsibility to not get it, moral responsibility to get it as a sort of robot in that kind of way.
Yeah, I think that, my general opinion, just like kind of departing from where you left off, is that like questions of this sort, I think, are beyond my competence. And I think they're beyond a lot of people's competence, which isn't to say that they can't be known by us, but that we have to rely on the research of those who are competent. And again, this kind of goes back to the question of authority and who does one trust and where does one look to find those whom he or she trusts, which is tough right now because I think a lot of people are feeling burned by that. And that's tough, but this seems like a kind of urgent issue. So just as a kind of encouragement to do some of the work. So yeah, there are reasons that this vaccine is different, right? There hasn't been a kind of max vaccination like this that I know of. There wasn't a vaccine for SARS-CoV-1. The turnaround was quick and the testing process was accelerated. And, this is some of the first vaccines deployed with this type of technology, but it seems that it's borne out by research as far as, like one with lay knowledge of these matters can discern. And you had mentioned an article by one of our brothers, Father Nicanor Austriaco, who is, you can maybe direct people to that, but...
Yeah. So Father Nicanor Austriaco is a Dominican friar of our province, has a doctorate in moral theology and a doctorate in, I believe it's molecular biology, but I could be wrong on exactly what it is, but I know it's from MIT. Very smart man. He has an article in Church Life Journal. It's just called "A Priest Scientist Responds to Concerns Raised by the Ramping Up of Vaccination Campaigns." I read that very strangely, so I apologize for that. But that's the title of it. So you can look it up. Father Nicanor, Father Nicanor also teaches at Providence College, but he kind of goes through his understanding of what's in the vaccine, sort of how one as a Catholic, both with respect to charity and the common good, ought to respond to receiving the vaccine, but also kind of looks at a couple of the pieces that, at least I've seen in the news, the sort of questions about infertility, the questions about reactions with mRNA and our own DNA and these sort of things. So it's not terribly long, and it's meant for general consumption. It's not like a peer-reviewed scientific article, but I checked that out. So Father Nicanor Austriaco, I found that to be a helpful read, actually, even, for myself. So a good resource.
Yeah. So I guess, the summary on this would be consult the science, try to cut through the spin as much as one can in like a 21st century spin saturated world. Just to kind of get down to what's actually at stake. So then that brings us to our last of the arguments that we're trying to kind of tease out the implications of or shed some light on. And this one, again, like we said at the beginning, is the most urgent. So there's certainly concern, big concern, urgent concern over the use of cell lines or germ lines that are derived from tissue of aborted children, some from, it seems, the 1970s or from the 1980s. Can you take us through what that means or what's involved?
Yeah. So if we're looking at the cells, so that there are, as far as what's on, as you probably, those of you who are listening probably already know, because this is no secret, but there are basically essentially three vaccines that are out there. Two for the Pfizer and the Moderna, and then the AstraZeneca is the third. The Pfizer and the Moderna, in their development and in the vaccine that's being distributed, they don't use aborted fetal cell lines in their research and their development, or in the vaccine that's being distributed. It did do, for part of the trials, in the laboratory, they did test on cell lines from aborted fetuses. They're called HEK93 or HEK93 fetal cell lines. They're basically kidney cells that were gathered from an aborted fetus in the 1970s that have been replicated in labs to basically do this sort of testing on these cells. So they're not, but it's the important thing, I guess the distinction here is that those cells, those from the aborted fetus cell lines, are not in the vaccine themselves. The AstraZeneca is different. The AstraZeneca does rely on aborted fetal cells for the replication of, as far as I understand, for the creation of the vaccine. So at least if you're looking at things that are coming out from the church, from the Holy See, from the USCCB, they're very clear to make a distinction between the Pfizer and Moderna and the AstraZeneca vaccine. That we'll talk about. The Father Gregory will probably talk about this in a second. That the Pfizer and Moderna are, when we're talking about cooperation with evil, are much more distant than the AstraZeneca would be, because of the use of these aborted stem cells and other cells that are in them.
Yeah, so with that, let's just, launch into a discussion then of cooperation with evil. So from the outset, it has to be acknowledged that this is a complicated, what would one say? Yeah, it's a complicated kind of debate in the life of the church. Not to say that everything's up for grabs, but there are finer points that remain kind of contested among Catholic theologians and have been contested for centuries. Which doesn't mean, though, that there isn't broad consensus as to what constitutes cooperation with evil. That's just to say that the conversation ends up being, as a result, somewhat technical. And so I think that it can be easy for someone who, doesn't have a training in moral theology to be somewhat overwhelmed by it. Why am I saying that? Because we are going to make it absolutely clear as day, clear as a bell, clear as, never mind, I don't know what the actual thing is. No, because I myself sometimes... Yeah, I listened to a bunch of lectures about it while hiking in preparation for this, and at the end of it, I was like, I think I understand this, but I also don't understand certain parts of it. So if you find it overwhelming, that's okay. All right, we're just going to walk through some of the basics, so that way you have a basic sense of what's being discussed when it does come up in conversation. Basically, it's called cooperation because the person concerned is doing some action with somebody who is, the main operator, as it were, so you're cooperating. And it's a matter of evaluating whether that cooperation is sinful or non-sinful. And it just basically depends on how you contribute to the moral act of the principal agent. So in any moral act, there's the thing that you're doing, there's the thing that you kind of ultimately want, and then there are the pertinent circumstances. So going back to the hiking example, what was I doing? Okay, so I was hiking, so I was walking to a point and then turning around and coming back. But then you might ask, well, why did you go hiking? It seems silly that you would, go to a place and then return to the same place. We're talking about 7 hours for zero displacement, and, judging by your haggard features, you don't need to burn any calories. So what could you possibly have wanted to do? Well, I wanted to go on a walk. I wanted to see beautiful things. I wanted to listen to a bunch of Thomistic Institute podcasts, right? So let's just pick one of those. I wanted to see beautiful things. So I went on a walk to see beautiful things. And the pertinent circumstances would be I was in the Swiss Alps. Okay, so the beautiful things that I saw were especially beautiful. So when we're evaluating that, when we ask whether this is a moral act, we have to take into account principally what were you doing it for? So is seeing beautiful things good? Yeah, I think that's good. Well, did you go about it in the right way? What if I said I really want to see this particular beautiful thing always and everywhere, right? So I'm going to buy up all the property. Actually, I'm going to steal all of the property around the lake so only I can see it. That would not be a good way by which to go about seeing the beautiful things. But rather, I went about it in the way that's appropriate. I drove a car, I parked it, I went and took a walk, I saw the beautiful things, and I got back in my car, and then I drove. And so everything about that act it holds up, right? Everything about that act is morally praiseworthy. But if we go ahead and, we come to discover that part of that act isn't morally praiseworthy, then that for us becomes, a question for concern. So at that point, you're able to evaluate, is this act good or is this act bad? And if bad, for what reason? And then as a cooperator, you're asking the question, how am I contributing to that? Am I really joining myself to the bad actor in a wholehearted way? Or am I giving something to the actor that makes it so that he can achieve his end, he can achieve his purpose, and without my contribution, he wouldn't be able to do so? Or is my contribution, lower grade, trivial, less important? So I think that in our ordinary practice of life, we experience the difference between really giving yourself to something and then only doing so in a trivial way. I don't know, Father Jacob Bertrand, what are some everyday examples of trivial things or everyday examples of big ticket items?
Yeah, so at least on the less important, the trivial side, I think something that often comes up is do we support or do we patronize? Is that when you go somewhere to buy things, patronize? Yeah. Do we patronize organizations that support Planned Parenthood, for example? Is it good to drink Starbucks coffee? Well, we know that Starbucks as an organization, as a corporation, donates directly to Planned Parenthood. They do that. I don't know if it's in their. It's probably not in their mission statement, but you can find that pretty readily. But is my buying a cup of coffee from Starbucks cooperating with Starbucks' donation to Planned Parenthood in such a close close way that my action of buying coffee becomes sinful. Well, in that circumstance, we're so removed from Starbucks decision and actual donation to Planned Parenthood that it doesn't. I don't think that it is sinful to buy or drink Starbucks coffee. On the other side of things, we could look at. We'll use Planned Parenthood again. They're an easy example here. Obviously, the doctor who's performing an abortion is committing a moral evil. There's an evil act there. But what about the people who work in Planned Parenthood? What about the nurse who assists? Well, the nurse who assists, there's a nurse. I assume that you need a nurse to perform the abortion. So the nurse who assists is essential to that. So though she's not performing it, she is cooperating in such a way that without her, the act wouldn't happen. So she's necessary to that, though she's not the primary agent. So because she's so closely linked, or he is so closely linked, we would say that there's a moral evil being done in that circumstance. So hopefully that kind of gives a sense of space and closeness to what's being done.
Yeah, and I think something too, just one other kind of like layer of complexity is, it's not just enough to say like, I don't want what this person wants. So in the case of the nurse, say she is pro-life, but this is the only job that she could find, and if she loses this job, then she can't support her family, and things will go south very quickly. Well, it's still sinful, right? Because it's not just a matter of having the right intentions, because if what you do, with your body signifies that you are for this thing, in a real, like we would say, proximate way, or you kind of give yourself to it in a way that's immediate, then that would still be kind of like considered part of your intention, because you intend, in effect, what you do. So it's not just like a mental event or a matter of mental gymnastics. So on the one hand, we do think that reason makes a contribution to moral acts, right? So intention is important. But on the other hand, like what you do makes a really significant contribution to moral acts. So we don't want to tend to one extreme or to the other and end up excluding some essential feature. So so when we take a vaccine that's uses either for production or for testing or for development cell lines that are derived from aborted fetuses, we in a certain sense kind of give ourselves to that practice. And so we would talk about it, and the language that you'll often hear is remote material cooperation with evil. So it's not formal because we're not saying, I intend this, nor does our act really say that we're giving ourselves to it wholeheartedly. But it's material in that, we tender some currency, we give some money. And the circumstances are somewhat mitigating by virtue of the fact that there aren't other options presently, right? And because the stakes are so high in the current kind of crisis. But I think that, there are kind of other ways by which we can kind of mitigate not the culpability, but the evilness of that action, in the sense that, one, we are encouraging of the development of vaccines that are made by alternate means, and certainly the church's teaching on this has been consistent, and other means have been pursued. I know, like my brother is a third-year PhD student in cellular and molecular biology. He works in a gene therapy and vaccines lab. He actually works in an mRNA lab, and this for him is a big question. And like his hope is, after getting his degree, is to found an ethically sound genetics company so that he can provide alternatives to some of these things. So it's very much in the Catholic mindset. So we don't want to say by our actions that we condone this, that it's fine, that we'll deal, we'll get over it, we'll accommodate the modern world. We're not saying that. We're continuing to profess what it is that we believe, to preach the gospel, and serve as a sign of contradiction and a witness. So go ahead.
Yeah, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops does, I think, in their letter on this, or their document on the moral considerations regarding the new COVID vaccines, does a really good job of explaining precisely why it's okay to receive the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, how they're sort of far enough away from the use of those fetal cells that they used in testing. And also, in certain circumstances where it'd be okay to use the AstraZeneca vaccine, but it does so. This document does so with respect to the things that we were, we began our episode with respect to the questions of charity and the common good in this extreme circumstance with a global pandemic. How do we as Catholics then react to something, something concrete that is affecting, the entire world? Is our getting the vaccine something that would be morally compromising? In this case with the Pfizer and the Moderna, the answer is no, it's not. It's we're far enough away from the participation in an evil act that it doesn't pose a moral problem for those of us. The AstraZeneca, in certain circumstances, it would pose a moral problem. Specifically here, if there were the options not to get the other options to get the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. So I think through a lot of what we've been talking about, things become, as Father Gregory was explaining before, talking about cooperation, that things are complicated, and they are. And I think part of our responsibility as good and prudent Catholics is to kind of dive into the complicated moral reality of this so as to make good decisions and not just sort of follow the blind commands of this or that news channel or whatever we see online or that sort of thing, and to trust that we have this sort of intellectual capacity to spend a little time thinking about what it is that we're doing in these moments.
Yeah. So those would be the main things that we wanted to kind of, what would you say, summarize or walk through. On the one side, considerations of charity, considerations of the common good. On the other side, just kind of general scientific concerns about vaccines, and then specifically this moral concern about cooperation. And we hope, as a way by which to genuinely free you, not in the sense that, the way the world talks about freedom, like you've got tons of options, do whatever, whatever the heck you darn well please. But in the sense of to be free for excellence, to choose something that's good, that represents your good, your flourishing, ultimately unto the glory of God. Those are some reasons. We hope they're helpful. Certainly not experts in any of those categories, but hopefully we can help direct to some resources that are more comprehensive and more searching in their knowledge. So those are my thoughts. Father Jacob Bertrand, any closings?
I don't think so. I think that's it. That's all we have to say. There's nothing more.
That's it. So thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Godsplaining. We hope that it will have been helpful for you. What are some other things that we say at the end of episodes? I will now say them, and I will say them in the proper order. Please, concretely, check out things that are worth checkouting. We post videos on YouTube. We recently invested in a service which makes those videos less atrocious. So maybe they'll be worth looking at. Chances are decent. At the very least, you can see the interior of Father Jacob Bertrand's office, which I know you've been dying to see. Check things out on YouTube and do subscribe to the channel. And then please like and share on whatever podcast app you're on, and then write a review, because that does something with math and algorithms and science, and then it makes it so that other people see that, and then they believe in Jesus, and then they go to heaven. Stakes are pretty high, so just ante up. And please consider supporting us on Patreon, so that way we can make videos that are less atrocious and also make other things that are good too. Again, our prayers are for you. Please pray for us, and we will chat with you next time on Godsplaining.
Thanks for listening to Godsplaining, a work of the Dominican Friars of the Province of St. Joseph. Visit us at opeast.org.